This is the video for social learning theory, and this is the homework mark scheme that we are going to look at. So, question 1, it's 2 marks for describe and 4 marks for application. So I really want you to practice your application and prioritise that over your description. So for the AO1, the 2 marks you get is if you made some reference to learning that involves observation, imitation, identification, vicarious reinforcement. So you need to mention learning. So you could talk about the idea that learning or behaviour is learnt through a process of observing and imitating role models that you identify with due to vicarious reinforcement. You don't need all of that, but just some reference to learning and how that process happens to get 1 mark. And then the second mark, you must acknowledge the role of cognition in learning. So the role of mediation. To get the second mark, you must make reference to the role of mediational process, and if possible, attention, retention, reproduction and motivation as well. So, for example, according to social learning theory, learning takes place through observation and imitation of a role model, 1 mark. Psychologists from the approach acknowledge the role of mediational processes, a cognitive process that goes alongside the environmental stimulus. And then the application. One thing that you need to mention in the procedure, children observe the action of the boy in the film who is a role model. So you need to mention the boy in the film who's a role model. After exposure, the children would model or imitate the boy's behaviour, stroking the puppy. So you must mention modelling and imitation, and you must also make sure it's application. So talk about stroking the puppy. The psychologist's comments acted as vicarious reinforcement, making the learning more likely. And for imitation to happen, the child or the children would need to pay attention to the boy, remember his behaviour, be physically able to replicate petting the dog, and have the motivation. That final one doesn't need to be in that level of detail, but you need to once again make reference to the role of mediational process. Additional points you could have made, using the role model of a boy of the same age, the same gender, encouraged identification. And you could also talk about, and this is possibly a new concept we've not touched on, but the idea that the learning might not be outwardly demonstrated but could still have been internalised, because this is social learning theory and therefore need not be overtly demonstrated at the time. So the idea is that social learning theory psychologists accept that learning can take place and be stored and be modelled at a later date, whereas behavioural psychologists say that the behaviour should be an immediate response to the stimulus for it to be considered. And again, this is another one with application. So suggest how Mr. Benson might use vicarious reinforcement to alter the behaviour of these children. Explain your answer with reference to social learning theory. 1 mark for a suggestion and 2 marks for explaining the suggestion. So in the context of social learning theory, 1 mark explaining the suggestion, 1 mark making the suggestion, 1 mark explaining how the suggestion might work, and 1 mark for contextualising, so it contextualising it to the approach. So talking about Mr. Benson, without the contextualisation, no marks. So the examples could be rewarding the child at the front in the queue in front of all the class for their orderly conduct by letting them exit first, praising them, giving privileges, giving them stars, giving them edible rewards, anything that you might suggest. The other one could be through negative vicarious reinforcement. So show the class vicarious punishment. Show the class a video of children being punished for pushing to the front of the queue. So 1 mark for the explanation, 1 mark for explaining, and then 1 mark for explaining the suggestion, linking it back to social learning theory, and 1 mark for applying it to the scenario. So just make sure you've said what the suggestion is, you've explained the suggestion linking it back to social learning theory, and you've contextualised it. If you've not done all those 3 things, you don't get all the 3 marks. And then referring to Bradley's experience, explain the role of mediational process. So first of all, you would get a mark for explaining the role of mediational process more generically. So a mental or cognitive process occurring between the stimulus, Bradley's observation, and response, Bradley copying the behaviour. Attention. Bradley wants to pay attention to the actions of the person he wants to copy, so he watches carefully. Make sure you've contextualised. If you haven't contextualised, you don't get any marks. So Bradley paid attention to the actions of the person by watching them carefully. Bradley tries to remember the actions so he can do the same. So he thinks about how he was holding the cue. He uses memory. He retains it. Reproduction. Bradley considers his own ability to perform. So he thinks whether he can do the same thing. Can he reproduce that pool playing, I think it is behavioural snooker, I can't remember off the top of my head, sorry. And finally, motivation. Bradley is motivated to attend to the relevant information because he is keen to play well. Each one of those will get you 4 marks. I would say you want a general, any of those 4 that you've mentioned will get you the 4 marks, I would say. Make sure you've contextualised. No contextualisation, no marks. That is it. Thank you very much.